People should exercise caution, and I'll give you some examples of the ways in which they should exercise caution. You will find that US military units, when self-reporting, of course, often speak in exculpatory language, redefine civilian casualties as insurgent casualties, downplay the number of casualties. And we know this by comparing these reports to the public record for where there has been comprehensive investigation. But when military units report on other military units, they are more likely to be frank, on other US military units. When they report on other allied units that are not from the US military, for example on the Poles or on the Brits, they are even more likely to tell the truth. And of course, when they are reporting on the Taliban, then all the evil comes out. Similarly, when we look at reporting from informers, we can see sometimes completely outlandish claims. They just don't hold water. The US assassination list, killer capture list in Afghanistan. There are many events associated with that. Some that resulted in the deaths of, one that resulted in the deaths of 7 children, and others that resulted in the deaths of a number of other innocents. It is up to a court to decide clearly whether something is, in the end, a crime. That said, prima facie, there does appear to be evidence of war crimes in this material.
Memorial Day is the celebration of American men and women who honorably served in the US military, honoring the code to protect human life honorably. Young men and women across this nation at a very young age who wish to serve with decency and respect for human life. And as they enter the military, their code seems to change when they are chosen to engage in the preconceived enemy in the world theater. Those initial codes of honor and dignity and protecting human life are replaced by the agendas and goals of sociopathic men in high positions of government and corporate power. The United States owes the world stage not just an apology, but justice. In keeping it recent, for the last 30 years, the United States has been engaging in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression, particularly countries in the Middle East. The United States is not a co-signer of the Rome Statutes, which is known as the International Criminal Courts at The Hague. Very few countries are co-signers: Israel, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iraq. Incidentally, these are the countries that engage in most of the conflicts around the world. Maybe that's a reason why they are not co-signers to the world courts. The war crimes that the United States are guilty of, go back to the first Gulf War. And in this video, I'm going to be naming many of the war crimes the United States have committed upon the Arab and Afghan people. Sunni and Shia. There seems to be no discrimination about who our federal government chooses to kill in the name of democracy. February 13th, 1991, during the first Gulf War, the United States Air Force destroyed a bomb shelter in the Amaria neighborhood of Baghdad, killing 314 civilians who were sheltering inside, in which 130 of them were children. Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz called the bombing a criminal, premeditated, planned attack against civilians. White House spokesman called the civilian deaths truly tragic and stated that they didn't know any civilians were at this location and described the Amaria shelter as a well-known military target. An American intelligence officer stated that the bunker was transmitting military signals until the moment of attack. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States government adopted several new measures in the classification and treatment of prisoners captured in the war on terror, including applying the status of unlawful combatants to some prisoners, conducting extraordinary renditions, and using torture, in which they labeled it as enhanced interrogation techniques. Bush White House counsel John Yoo and David Addington circumvented the Geneva Conventions and human rights laws to those labeled enemy combatants, in which they bypassed the Department of Justice and allowed the president to make that decision, not informing the Secretary of State Colin Powell, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, and Attorney General John Ashcroft, who were not in the loop regarding Dick Cheney's decision authorized by President Bush regarding the memo. The torture of detainees was extensively detailed in a Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA torture. February 7, 2002, presidential memorandum authorized U.S. interrogators of prisoners captured in the war on terror to deny the prisoners basic protections required by the Geneva Conventions, and thus, according to Jordan Faust, professor of law and formerly a member of the faculty of Judge Advocates General School, quote, necessarily authorized and ordered violations of the Geneva Conventions, which are war crimes, end quote. Based on the president's memorandum, U.S. personnel carried out cruel and inhumane treatment on captured enemy fighters, which necessarily means that the president's memorandum was a plan to violate the Geneva Convention, and such a plan constitutes a war crime under the Geneva Conventions, according to Professor Faust. U.S. Attorney General Alberto Gonzales and others have argued that detainees should be considered unlawful combatants, and as such, not be protected by the Geneva Conventions in multiple memoranda regarding these perceived legal gray areas. Gonzales' statement that denying coverage under the Geneva Conventions substantially reduces the threat of domestic criminal prosecution under the War Crimes Act suggests to some authors an awareness by those involved in crafting policies in this area that U.S. officials are involved in acts that could be seen to be war crimes. The U.S. Supreme Court challenged the premise on which this argument is based in Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, in which it ruled that common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions applies to detainees in Guantanamo Bay, and that the military tribunals used to try these suspects were in violation of U.S. and international law. Shortly before the end of President Bush's second term in 2009, news media in countries other than the United States began publishing the views of those who believe that under the United Nations Convention Against Torture, the U.S. is obligated to hold those responsible for prisoner abuse to account under criminal law. One proponent of this view was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, Professor Manfred Nowak, who on January 20th, 2009, remarked on German television that former President George W. Bush had lost his head of state immunity, and under international law, the United States would now be mandated to start criminal proceedings against all those involved in these violations of the United Nations Convention Against Torture. Other crimes that the United States have committed in Afghanistan were the Bagram torture and prisoner abuse, the Kandahar massacre, the Kunduz hospital airstrike, the Mayward district murders, the Clint Loras murders, the Dasht Lele massacre. When it comes to Iraq, the Abu Ghraib torture and prisoner abuse, the Mahmoudiya killings, the John E. Hatley murders, the Hamdaria incident, the Nisor Square massacre, the incident involving Eddie Gallagher, a retired U.S. SEAL who came to national attention after he was charged in September 2018 with 10 offenses under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, in which he was accused of fatally stabbing a 17-year-old ISIS prisoner, photographing himself with the corpse and sending the photo to friends. As well as the more infamous Haditha massacre. On November 19, 2005, in Haditha, Iraq, Staff Sergeant Frank Wooltrich led Marines from the 3rd Battalion into Haditha. In Al-Subtani, a neighborhood in Haditha, Lance Corporal Miguel Terrazas was killed by a roadside improvised explosive device. Later in the day, 24 Iraqi women and children were shot dead by Staff Sergeant Frank Woolrich and his Marines. Woolrich acknowledged in military court that he gave his men the order to shoot first, ask questions later. After the roadside bomb explosion, Woolrich told military judge Lieutenant Colonel David Jones, quote, "I never fired my weapon at any women or children that day," end quote. On January 24, 2012, Frank Woolrich was given a sentence of 90 days in prison, along with a reduction in rank and pay. Just the day before, Woolrich pled guilty to only one count of negligent dereliction of duty. No other Marine that was involved that day was sentenced to any jail time. As for the massacre, the Marine Corps paid $38,000 total to the families of 15 of the dead civilians. This is not a general description of our U.S. military, but it is a warning to those young men and women who want to honorably serve and protect human life. My advice is this: you don't need a stripe to wear honor. You do not need a gun to uphold and protect human life. You need to act in defiance of enemies, foreign and domestic. The enemy is not in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in Syria or Libya. It is right here in the United States. They are called the United States federal government. And they are the ones who are appointing our young men and women to aimlessly kill people in the name of democracy. It's time we start fighting back